Good evening, everybody. I'm Mike Rainier from the Department of Bioengineering, and I'd like to welcome you to the lecture series this evening, the second of our lectures from the engineering school. For those of you that joined us for the first lecture, we heard from Dr. Chuck Murray, who's from Departments of Medicine, Pathology, and Bioengineering, and his talk about an exciting UW program in cardiac tissue engineering and the heart regeneration program. This evening, we're going to continue our series on engineering the heart and turn our focus to a critical fluid that the heart pumps, and that's blood and blood cells. Whether it's from trauma due to a car crash or a genetic condition, when we suffer an injury, stemming blood loss is a critical component to survival. Tonight, you'll hear about technologies that look at cell function, particularly the process of blood clotting through the lens of an engineer. We're going to have two speakers this evening, both of them named Nathan. Our first speaker will be Nathan White, who is an assistant professor in emergency medicine, and he also has adjunct appointments in bioengineering and mechanical engineering. He's a practicing clinician at Harborview Medical Center, emergency medicine department, and his research focuses on bleeding and hemostasis in critical illness and injury. The second speaker will be his collaborator, Dr. Nathan Sniadecki, who's an associate professor of mechanical engineering and also has an adjunct appointment in bioengineering. Nathan's research focuses on cell biomechanics, biomems devices, and bioinstrumentation. So at this time, I'd like to welcome up Nathan White.
Thank you very much, Mike. Let me just first say that it's really an honor for me to be here speaking with you this evening, and I would like to give big thanks to the College of Engineering for inviting me to be here. Today we're going to talk about cell biomechanics and focusing around a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is bleeding and how to stop it. Title of our presentation is Get a Grip. Just some housekeeping to start with here. Here's our financial disclosures. So I'm an emergency physician. I work here at Harborview Medical Center in the emergency department. It's the area's level 1 trauma center, which means we can take care of the most critically injured patients from approximately 4 states. I see injured people all the time, and I see bleeding patients all the time. And I've studied this problem, and I've constantly sought out solutions. So when I came to UW almost about 4 years ago now, I actively sought out folks who I thought could help me to improve the lives of these patients by stopping their bleeding early on. And this is what led me to the College of Engineering and specifically to mechanical engineering and to Professor Sniadecki, where we've been collaborating now for about 3 years and looking at new and exciting technologies to be used to help me deal with these bleeding patients that I see almost every day. So first, let's stand back a bit and talk about trauma and bleeding. So trauma is the leading cause of death for young people under the age of 44. It often strikes suddenly and without warning, and anyone can be affected. It usually starts out like this, maybe on a roadway or a highway, I-5 perhaps, where there's a car crash and an injury. The next phase of care is then transport. We have to find the patient, package them, and transport them to the nearest hospital or trauma center. Where we see these patients in the emergency department, what we try to do is evaluate how sick they are and stabilize their condition as rapidly as possible. And in the case of patients who are rapidly bleeding, who have lost a significant amount of blood, what often happens is they go immediately to surgery with our trauma surgeons, who actually go in and try to find major areas of bleeding and stop them. Now, you can imagine that this process takes time. And during this entire process, if the patient continues to lose blood, they can lose quite large amount of blood, and this can be very life-threatening. So the average time it takes us in the emergency department to evaluate the patient and get the patient to the OR for surgery is about 2 hours. Now, the median time, if a patient who's experienced major trauma in the state of Washington comes to the emergency department and they die, the median time it takes for them to die from the point that they hit the emergency room door is about 15 minutes. So you can imagine that not only do we need to rapidly figure out where the patient is bleeding and try to control it, but we have to do it very quickly. And so what I'd like to do in my portion of this talk is really give you an example and walk you through the process of bleeding after trauma and highlight how cellular mechanics really plays an important and critical role in that process. So for our example, I hope you recognize this guy, famously known as probably one of the most traumatized people ever, known for having more metal in his body than bone, actually. Of course, it's Evel Knievel, famous Daredevil. And so let's just use him as an example. You probably recognize this also. This is his, I would say, infamous attempt at jumping the fountains in Caesar Palace. Okay, and I think we all know how this ended up, like this. So let's just say in this example that Evel was unlucky. This did not actually happen, but let's just say he took a direct, severe blunt force injury to the chest. Now, what I'd like to do is take you on a journey inside his body and eventually inside his blood clot to see how his body responds to this type of injury. So let's zoom in a little bit. Here's his aorta. This is the main blood vessel that runs inside, that comes off of the heart here and runs down through the chest and the abdomen, supplies all the blood to our body. And in these situations of severe blunt force injury, what can happen, if we zoom in and take a closer look, is that this major vessel can become injured. And if we see here, this is an angiogram of an aorta that's been partially ruptured. This is a typical injury in this situation and a typical location for this injury. And if we zoom in even a little bit closer, we can see what's actually happened to Evel is that he's unlucky enough to have partially ruptured one wall of his aorta. And he's now collecting blood outside of his aorta. Now, it's fairly contained, or else he'd be dead already in this situation, which is lucky for him in this situation. So let's just imagine that we can actually go in and watch this process of what's happening anatomically, and we can actually do that if we use a diagnostic tool like ultrasound. So this is not an aorta. This is actually a femoral artery. Let me orient you here. So the femoral artery is lying under here. This artery has been injured. The femoral artery is here, which has been injured. And what we see is a wound pocket with blood collecting into it. On your left-hand side is the plain ultrasound image. You can see the swirling of the blood within the wound cavity. On your right-hand side, we can see a Doppler image where we've used Doppler to now pixelate and color that blood flow. So we can actually see that stream of blood squirting out of the artery into the wound pocket. So this is probably similar to what's happening inside of Evel right now. This is 30 minutes later after the same injury. You can see still quite brisk bleeding happening here. This is 60 minutes later. So what we see, what happens over time is eventually this bleeding starts to slow down. So this can happen for usually one of two reasons. Either you start to run out of blood, or something starts to impede, your body starts to respond, and you start to impede this bleeding site, start to work against it to try to contain it. And if we look a little bit closer around the injury, so this is in the area that we call the hematoma, or the collection of blood that's now outside of the vessel that's surrounding this injury site. And if we look early on, within 5 minutes of the injury, you can see the bleeding site is right here, and you see that it's still this sort of liquid swirling mass. But if we look 3 hours later, you can see that the swirling mass is now solidified, and it's actually capped and contained this bleeding that's going on internally. So what is doing this? This is the actual process of clot formation, sort of in real time. So we were able to actually go back and use ultrasound shear elastography to map the stiffness of this blood clot as it develops over time. You can see some shear values here, and we took several measurements here throughout all of these areas, mapped them all together, and what we found was very interesting was that very early on, we have a large area of low shear, or this essentially liquid area, the swirling area. But as time goes on, the stiffness of the wound pocket starts to increase, and we see a decrease in this shear area, or this low shear area, where we're actually seeing this clot develop over time, and we're watching the process of containment of the bleeding. This is what our bodies do naturally. So what is it that's actually doing this? I'm going to show you a big blood clot on the next slide, so there's your warning. It's the clot, right? So this isn't just, it isn't your mom's Jell-O mold, okay? It's a highly structured material that I think you'll appreciate has specific properties that are designed to contain and stop bleeding. It's actually very interesting. So let's zoom in again. I want to go inside this clot, and I'll show you how it comes together. So this is made up of several different components. One is fibrin fibers, which is this meshwork that's laid down, this fibrous network. The cellular component is primarily made up of two types of cells: red blood cells, which are entrapped in the network, and specialized cells called platelets. So platelets are the small motors that drive this clot formation. And these are the cells that start to use their mechanics to create the clot and stop bleeding. This is what we call hemostasis. This is the process of bleeding cessation, essentially. So we have a severed vessel. The first thing that arrives on scene is platelets. They start to arrive, they start to clump, and they start to activate. And then they start to build this fibrin network on top of themselves that encapsulates Once this fibrin plug is formed, the platelets then turn on again, and they grab the clot and they contract it down, giving it tensile strength. This is what platelets look like when they're just circulating in our blood, when they're dormant. This is what they look like when they're active. You can see it's a big change. This is an activated platelet here compared to a red blood cell. And one of the important properties of platelets is that when they turn on, they get sticky. So as you can see here in these two examples, on the left, this is platelet-rich plasma. On your left, yes, and on your right, this is the same plasma that's been activated with a platelet activator. What they immediately do is they clump together. They essentially go to ground with each other. Now, a lot of times this is in response to shear. Shear is the tangential force that's applied as blood flows down the vessel wall. And when platelets are exposed to high levels of shear, they almost instantaneously turn on and undergo these activating changes, which includes expressing sticky proteins on their surface so that they stick together and turning on their internal motors, which I'll show you next. So this is another example of what we call primary hemostasis, or platelet aggregation in response to increasing shear. So this is an experimental condition here where we see an increase in the shear that's applied over time. And I want you to watch what happens to these platelets. They're incubated with a sticky protein called von Willebrand factor in this case. So at first, you see fairly small platelets flying by from left to right. And then as the shear is increased, you can see an almost immediate increase in clumping of the platelets, in aggregation. And as the shear is increased once again, you can see these very large clumps start to develop. So you can imagine this is what happens when those platelets encounter these sticky proteins under high shear conditions in that wound pocket that we just saw. So platelets are not only sticky, but they actually work like motors. What they like to do when they turn on is reach out and grab things and pull them back in to consolidate. And this is the primary mechanics component of clot formation that makes your clot not only form and be there and fill space, but to actually be mechanically useful to stop bleeding. This is what's called the marginal band. It's a band of contractile proteins within the platelet. And when the platelet is activated, this band twists on itself and the platelet starts to move in very neat ways. And I'll show you an example here. Here we have on the left-hand side is an image of a platelet. On the right-hand side is a fluorescent image of the marginal band in inside of that platelet. And you'll see what happens when this platelet is activated. Here we have the platelet on the left, fairly dormant looking, and you see the marginal band on the right. You see it's moving around just a bit, and then it's activated. Now watch what happens. You see it starts to, and suddenly the band twists on itself and all these little arms come out and start feeling around for something to grab onto. It's actually really neat, kind of scary. And then it spreads, looking for something to grab and hold on to. And then this one little arm on the bottom comes out at the end. It's really neat. Okay, so what is the effect on the clot? How does this help our clots stop us from bleeding? So what it does is it grabs these fibrin fibers that are there in this meshwork and it applies tension to them. So it's essentially pre-tensioning the clot to put it in an optimal mechanical state to withstand the jet of blood that's shooting at it and pounding against it, essentially. And this is why. It's because that fibrin network is not just fibers. It has special properties. It has what we call non-Newtonian strain behavior, which means that as it stiffens in a nonlinear fashion as a strain is applied to it by these platelets. So it puts it right in an optimal window where it needs to be so that it can be the best clot it can be. So if we start to put all this together, what we can really think of a clot now is not just a jello mold, but it's really a sophisticated material. And it's similar to what we see when we pre-tension concrete. So what you do is you pull your rebar, and then you cast your concrete around it, and then you let the rebar go and contract, and it compacts that concrete. And it gives it special mechanical properties to withstand these exterior forces that are applied on it. The very same thing is happening biologically within us to stop bleeding. So let's bring it all together. I want you to watch clot formation from start to finish. Now this is in a microvessel, and there are several components of the clot that are forming here at once. The platelets I want you to pay a special attention to, which are outlined in red here, or they're stained red. So here we go. This is laser injury to the endothelium layer here in the vessel, and then let's watch this clot form. So the first thing we see arriving, again, are platelets. They get sticky, and they're activated by this shear force here to make them stop and hang around this wound site. They start to aggregate. They get bigger and bigger. And you can see the clot starts to invade into the lumen of the vessel. Now, if you keep watching, you'll see this platelet aggregate actually start to contract. Here it goes. So now it's contracting itself back down. Now it's stiffening and anchoring itself to that wound. And you can see the other important property here is that it actually contracts itself back out of the lumen so that you can maintain blood flow in that vessel. It's very interesting. So from start to finish, that's how your blood clot forms, and that's why cellular mechanics are so critical in this process. So what about our Daredevil? So what's happened in the evil while I've been talking about platelets? So lucky for him, he arrived at a trauma center where they actually have started to recognize these mechanical properties of blood clots and to use them both diagnostically and therapeutically. And some of the ways that we do that is using mechanical devices like this one. This is called ROTEM, or rotational thromboelastometry. And it's a fancy name, but it's quite a simple device. What it is that you have a cup where you put your blood. You have a pin that's inserted that rotates back and forth a certain amount. You activate the blood to clot. As it clots, it couples the pin to the cup, which impedes or affects the motion of this rotation, and that's simply plotted out over time. So what we get is a mechanical depiction of clot formation from start to finish. Here, you have the clotting time, which represents the time it takes to begin clot formation. We have the rate of clot formation. We have the clot strength or firmness, MCF, maximal clot firmness. This is primarily a product, again, of that fibrin mesh and the platelets pulling on that fibrin mesh. And then we have clot breakdown, which is called lysis. And this is the opposite of clot formation, and this is always activated at the same time so that we can maintain balance when we form clots within our body. This actively chews up that clot that's being formed. So what we want is a nice balance between these opposing forces when we're making clots in our body. And what we can actually do is now guide our therapy according to clotting mechanics. So if we see that there's an abnormal increase in onset time, we can give coagulation factors to that patient. If we see that the clot strength is reduced, we can give platelets and we can give fibrinogen and plasma and blood products to these patients. And if we see there's an increase in clot breakdown or clot lysis, we can give drugs that inhibit that process. And this is all actively being done for trauma patients right now. So I just want to wrap up with saying thank you. And luckily for Old Evil, he arrived at a trauma center. They managed his coagulation, restored his clot formation, and an expert cardiothoracic surgeon repaired his aorta, and he lived to ride again. Thank you. I would just like to say a quick thanks to my colleagues in the Division of Emergency Medicine and the Emergency Medicine Research Laboratory, to my friends at the Morad Lab, who were expert in ultrasound, who provided many of the images you saw tonight, and of course to Professor Sniadecki, who I'll turn the podium over to, and his Cell Biomechanics Lab.
Thank you, Nathan. So my collaboration with Nathan actually started from him sending me an email saying that I had just seen my paper from my lab where we were putting platelets on a device like you see over here, and it caught his eye. You know, my lab is focused on cell mechanics. We're interested in the forces that cells generate when they crawl or they contract, and I hadn't thought about trauma. And Nathan came into my office. He was a new, young faculty here at campus, and he was very excited about what we could do and said, you know, you could use this for coagulopathy. And I said, what is coagulopathy? But basically, it's the body's inability to clot. It's an anticoagulated state. And he had pointed me to some particular, grants to go after, but he and I started up a collaboration. And so let me just tell you a little bit about how we came together and what we were working on. So this is my background here, and I'm going to go into more detail about that. What you're seeing in panel A is a small chip. This is a glass and silicone device that you can put really any kind of cell onto. And in my lab, we were putting platelets on it because we were also looking mostly into platelets for transfusions and how you store platelets. And what you see in panel B is just a schematic of how this works. You can have platelets that you've isolated from blood, and you just have them in solution. And as soon as you give thrombin to them, it's a potent kick in the pants that gets these platelets activated. They form a clot that attaches to these arrays of microposts. And as you can see in panel C, this is just a cantilever beam. So every sophomore in mechanical engineering knows this equation here. Basically, it's a spring. It's Hooke's law. So the amount of deflection of one of these pillars is proportional to the amount of force. It's a spring equation. And we know how stiff these are because we're able to measure the diameter. They're around 3 micrometers in diameter. And just to give you guys a frame of reference, your hair is around 100 micrometers. So these are much smaller than your hair. So you really can't see them. You have to use a microscope. But you can kind of gauge their shape in panel D, where you're seeing this array of little fine cantilevers. And in panel E is a group of these platelets colored in green that are attached. And we are able to measure how much force these group of platelets are generating as they form this microclot based upon how far the tips of these pillars have deflected. And then you see that with those force vectors. You can see how much force is being generated by those platelets as they attach. So this is cell biomechanics here. And you can use an assay like this to try different reagents that you know will activate clotting. So in panel F, we're trying different concentrations of thrombin to see how we can maximally activate these platelets. Thrombin is used in the clinic in surgeries to actually stop bleeding in locations. You can apply it topically. In fact, actually, Zymogenetics, who's a company here in Seattle, makes a version of thrombin called Ricothrom that's also used to stop bleeding in locations. So how do we make these really small pillars? Well, we use the same technology that you use to actually make computer chips and your cell phone processors. It's really done inside of a clean room. So the same technology that Intel uses to make semiconductors, we can use to make three-dimensional structures. So on the left column here, you see a process known as photolithography, which is basically a fancy way of saying using light to carve into stone. But we're not really carving into stone. We're actually building up a material on a silicon wafer. So that material is called, in this case, SU8, which is a type of photoresist. It's basically a polymer, a liquid polymer that's sensitive to light. So wherever light shines on it will cause this polymer to become cross-linked and stiff. So we can control where that light passes by using a chrome mask. This is basically a window where you have regions where light does not pass through in black, and then regions where light passes through, little windows in white. And so wherever that light passes through, the SU8 becomes cross-linked, and it forms a pillar structure, shown at the bottom left, because we've washed away all the spots that have not been exposed to light. Now, that takes one of my graduate students maybe a couple days in the clean room to make a really good device. And if we want to use it for blood and gooky things, that's a lot for us of time to build something that we then just have only one use for. So, PhDs are long, but I don't want them to be that long. So what we use is a three-dimensional photocopy system, which we really call soft lithography. Here we're using silicone rubber. So silicone, you pour it over the structure while the silicone is wet. You add some heat, and now you have a rigid copy of that structure, which you can peel off. And then you can use that as a mold to make another copy in silicone. So from that one master that one of my graduate students spends time making, you can make thousands to millions of copies. I don't think we've reached 1 million in my lab yet, but we're quite close to that. So now we have something that's clear, something that's biocompatible, and something that we can get cells to stick on. So to do that, we need to put protein down. Cells like to stick to the same materials that they have in their body. So in this case, we want to use proteins that the cells would stick to at a wound site. So here we can absorb fibrinogen or any other kind of protein that you would find in the walls of your arteries. So we use what's called a PDMS stamp or a silicone stamp. And you can think of this process similar to those rubber stamps you might have used, or your grandchildren or kids might have used, to stamp rainbows or unicorns onto paper. It's the same kind of process. You have a silicone material and an ink. And that ink is a solution of protein. So that protein will absorb onto the stamp, and now we have it captured there. So in that second column, we can activate the surface of the PDMS using some UV light. And now when we bring our stamp into contact with the pillars, we get protein to transfer across wherever we have the contact. So basically, we get protein to transfer on the tips of our posts. We then coat the rest of it with some reagents that will prevent any additional protein from absorbing, and then we're ready to go to put some platelets on it. So what you're seeing here are some platelets that are forming a microclot on our pillars. And actually, these are someone's platelets who are in this room here today. I won't say who it is, but they were talking before me. And these are pretty strong platelets, I would say. Good job, you know. But what you're seeing here are little platelets forming a collection of a group of them, holding tight onto the tips of the pillars, and you can see them bending the pillars. And we know how much force there is by how much these pillars are bending. You can see also that some of these pillars have just a single platelet. They're lonely. They haven't found any friends yet, so they're not really able to bend the pillars. Now, this type of system is great for the lab. We can use it to look at a bunch of different drugs or compounds that can change the behavior of these platelets. So here are 3 experimental drug compounds that we were testing in my lab. Basically, these are ways of causing platelets to relax. Maybe you want to break up these clots. And as Nathan talked about, the more these platelets generate force, the stronger and more stable this clot can be. Well, that's very good if you're in trauma, if you're in Nathan's world. But the other thing about platelets is they're very important for young people in trauma, but they're also very bad in the case of thrombosis for the older population. So there you have sometimes clots that you need to bust, to break up. So here are 3 compounds that we were using to just relax these platelets, make them weaker so that way they can get dissolved away faster. And so what you're seeing here is a relaxation. So in these curves at the bottom, we used Y27, which inhibits a protein that causes the platelets to contract. And when we added different concentrations of Y27, we see less force. We did the same thing with another compound that inhibits MLCK, which stands for myosin light chain kinase, and we see a relaxation. And we also did it for a blebbistatin, which is an inhibitor of myosin, which is also a way of relaxing these cells. So this is where my lab was at really before meeting Nathan White. And this is great. This data, we love this data, but it took us 3 months to get this data. And this is not something you'd want to do for a trauma patient, where you really have an hour to figure out what's wrong and how to make a change. So we needed to go faster. But really, we knew that this measurement of force was the right way for us to look at this problem. This cup and cone that Nathan talked about with thromboelastography is good, but you're really not looking at the platelets directly, which are doing the work in this clot. So this is our solution. This is what we call our block and post technology. And this is a very rapid way to form a clot and to measure whether the clot can be strong or if it's weak. So on the left, you're seeing a microfluidic device where blood can be injected into an inlet. It passes through a small duct, a small microchannel, and then the blood flows back out again through the outlet. But we don't really care where the blood flows out to. We really want to know what's happening to the blood in that microchannel. And what you're seeing there is our clot force sensor. So you can see that in the video. We have a block, we have a post, and as blood is passing through, the platelets are binding and aggregating like they would to a wound surface in the body. We've coated this with collagen, which is a protein in the blood vessels, to get these platelets to stick. And we have an array of these block and posts. And in the right column, you're seeing these platelets that have been formed 40 seconds or 70 seconds after the blood has entered into our device. And they're already generating forces that we can measure with our device. So I have a video here that one of my graduate students made that takes you into our lab, lets you see how this whole process works. Let me just get this video to play. So these are very small sensors, 1/10 the size of a human hair. And this is a sped up video, but we really do work this fast in my lab. You'll see. So we go to the clean room, and back we have our master silicone mold that we didn't need to make a copy of with PDMS. That's that silicone rubber. So we pour it on, and we take it to the oven to heat it up and cure it. Now we can peel it off, and we actually have our microchannels. We need to coat it with protein, so we have to treat the surface, and then we can flow in the collagen that we need for the platelets to stick to. We use blood in my lab, and we have a good donor source here on campus of individuals who want to get $15 for blood. And we test their blood in my lab. We can use different inhibitors to affect how the clotting works, so we can prepare our samples. And from here, we can then take it over to our microscope, where we can pump it through a syringe down into our device, where we're looking at what's happening using a microscope. We keep everything at 37 degrees because that's body temperature. And so as that blood is flowing through one of those inlets, the microscope down below is imaging how are those posts moving. So this is Lucas here, who did his PhD on this work. But what's happening is the shear, which you see in these red zones, is very high over the block and post, which is causing these platelets to activate. And as they activate, they can start to consolidate together, forming a firm little microclot. So we're using an optical system to measure how much deflection there is. You can see under our optical detection that we can look at the original position of a post, and over time we can see where the tip has moved to after 120 seconds. And so from that, we have a way of looking at how much force gets generated, not after 3 months, but really after 3 minutes. So what you're seeing in the black curve is a normal blood response. You see a delay in the first 30 seconds where there's no force, and then you start to see the force increase rapidly over time, and within 2 minutes, you've reached almost the maximum force that these group of platelets can generate. Now, let's say a person has coagulopathy. Let's say their coagulation process is impaired. This would be something like you see in the red curve here, where the force is lower. This would be something that Dr. Nathan White, if you were coming into Harborview, would raise the red alarms and cause them to rethink how they're going to be treating this person, because they may be at risk of internal bleeding. So we spent some time looking at the sensitivity of this device to different inhibitions of the clotting process. So in the left side, you have heparin. And oftentimes you may go on heparin if you're going to have a catheter-type surgery. And 15 USP is sort of twice the normal concentration that you would see. 30 is very high. And what's happening here, as you've increased the concentration of heparin, you're inhibiting the thrombin production within the blood, and you're seeing less force being generated. Now, in the second column is platelet dysfunction. This is often happening due to injury, but maybe even to the medication that you're on. ASA stands for acetylsalicylic acid, which is aspirin. And what you're seeing here is an inhibition of these platelets due to aspirin. So at 0.1, this is equivalent to a baby aspirin, about 81 milligrams. And already you're seeing a dramatic loss in force of these platelets. 0.5 is maybe about 2 regular strength aspirins. And you really see a major inhibition of these platelets. And the last column is fibrinolysis. This is the destruction of a clot. We get clots in our body, and our bodies naturally remove these after time, after the hole has been fixed. However, in trauma, this lysis can start to get accelerated, and whatever plug is being closed gets dissolved away, and leaking happens again. And so one of the ways that this happens is by the activation of plasmin, which is an enzyme. Well, here we've activated plasmin with a clot-busting drug known as tissue plasminogen activator, or TPA. And with that, we're also seeing a loss in force. So really, we've got the ability to look at different natures of your coagulopathy and help to diagnose what kind of transfusions you need to have. If your thrombin is inhibited, you need plasma. If your platelets are dysfunctional, you need a platelet transfusion. Or if there is accelerated lysis, you need something that will undo that process, like tranexamic acid. So Nathan and I have actually taken this to the next level. With a lot of support from the University of Washington, we've been able to form a spin-out company on this. And the goal is to develop a point-of-care device that will be in the emergency rooms as well as in the paramedics' hands to help to diagnose an injured patient's coagulopathy state so that they can get the proper medical care in the fast amount of time. And to be honest, this would not have happened without the strong support from the University of Washington's Center for Commercialization. It was through them that we met Bob Berry. And Nathan and I are very good at what we do in the university and the hospital, but we're not business people. And so really having that partnership has been a fantastic thing for us in being able to take this technology out of the lab and towards a real product, which we're hoping to see in a few years. Now, I want to take a few more minutes as well to talk about some of the other biomechanics that's going on in my lab. Well, we've been looking more closely at platelets. And so what you're seeing here are arrays of nanopillars. So instead of using light to make our pillars, we're using electrons. We're using what's called e-beam lithography, or electron beam lithography. And using some fancy magnets, we can now write the smallest pillars possible using this current of electrons. And so with that, we can now make super small PDMS pillars, which you see in the lower right, that we can look at the single platelet force. So this is an individual platelet, nobody's in this room here, that is very strong. And working in collaboration with the Puget Sound Blood Center, we're looking to see how do platelets bind to a wound surface and how do they transmit forces to that surface. And we've actually been discovering some new receptors that were not recognized in this process. So we're hoping that this is going to lead to some new antiplatelet medication that could help in combating thrombosis. We can hopefully talk more about that in the future with you guys. The other thing is tugging forces. Now, we're moving away from platelets here. We're now moving to cells that have a nucleus. And in your body, you're made up of 10 trillion cells. And those cells do not like to be by themselves. They like to hold hands, and they like to pull against each other to hold that tissue together. So using our micropillars, we've been able to actually measure the tugging force between two cells. So we make these little bow tie patterns, or two triangles pointing at each other. And with that, we can measure how much force is being transmitted across the junction between two platelets. So what you're seeing in green, and right between where those two platelets are coming together, is a protein that forms the junction between these cells. And what we've seen is that where the cells tug stronger against each other, we see better, stronger junctions. So what does this mean? Well, the more cells tug against each other, the more hands that they build to hold with each other. But where my lab was interested is, what does this mean for your blood vessels, for leaky pipes? This is a bad situation for arteriosclerosis, or heart disease, where you can have plaque buildup in your blood vessels when you have high vascular leakiness. And what's rather interesting, it's the leakiness of your blood vessels is controlled by the inner layer of your veins and arteries, which are your endothelial cells. And they have junctions between them. And what's rather interesting is these junctions behave differently depending upon the flow around them. So on the right here, you see an image of a carotid artery. And here you have a split or a bifurcation. In some regions, you have very smooth laminar flow. Think of how when you first turn on the faucet, it's a nice steady stream. But in those red regions, you have disturbed flow, which is where the blood circulates back. You have not smooth, you have almost turbulent, but not really. But in these two regions, the red regions and the blue regions, you have a different amount of leakiness. The endothelial cells have more gaps in the red region and less gaps in the blue region. So we wondered, could this also be due to a difference in the tugging forces between these cells? We hypothesized that the tugging forces would be higher between those endothelial cells in the laminar region because they're pulling stronger against each other to help to seal those blood vessels. So to look at this, we put a group of cells on our microposts and we subjected them to flow. We had disturbed flow and we had laminar flow built into a bioreactor. And we looked at the forces that these cells were generating. And in the first column, you see cells that were just under static conditions. In the second one, you see laminar. And the third column, you see disturbed flow. And what you notice in the laminar flow is there's a lot more force being generated by these cells. On the bottom row, you see all those little force vectors. There's a lot more of them, and they're a lot bigger under those cells under the laminar flow. So we then wanted to measure the tugging forces between these cells. And what we found was the intercellular force was higher under these cells under laminar flow. And also the junctions, the amount of protein between these cells, was also higher under the laminar. That's the blue or L bar graphs here. So what we're finding is that the shear flow affects the forces, both the traction and the tugging forces that these cells generate, and that affects the junctions between these cells. So these tugging forces may be another way for how these cells regulate the vascular leakage. So what does this mean? Well, these are regions, wherever you have these gaps are spots where platelets could stick and form a clot where you don't want it. And so what disturbs the flow? Well, we have natural turns, we have natural bifurcations in our blood vessels, but we also change the flow. We get bypass surgery, which can remodel how the blood flows in our vessels, which can then change the wall and how the blood vessel is leaky. Now let's turn to the heart. It's a close topic to my heart. Cardiomyocytes are the individual cells that pump our blood in our heart. And actually this is a collaboration that Professor Mike Rainier and I started when I first got here at University of Washington. And what you see on the left here are rat heart cells beating on these microposts. And so for every second, they're doing something. So these are a lot more exciting to us than most other cells since they're very active, and you can watch this under a microscope and just be amazed as watching an individual heart cell contract. But what we noticed was these guys respond to the environment that they're in. If you put them in a soft substrate, or in this case, very tall and flexible posts, they don't generate much force. But if you put them on a much stiffer environment, they generate tons of force. And so what we were able to find is that this change in stiffness is very similar to what happens during development. A newborn's heart gets 3 times stiffer after birth, and that helps to trigger as a cue to the heart to become stronger. So maybe this is something that we can use to help build new heart cells, like the work that Chuck Murray talked about last time. And in fact, Chuck and I are collaborating as well. This is one of his stem cells that has been transformed into a heart cell. And you're watching it beat on the microposts. So where we are playing a role with my lab is as Chuck and his lab are developing new technologies and new treatments to make these stem cells better heart cells, we're playing the role of the biomechanical assessors. We're kind of like the NFL combine, you know. Are these cells strong enough, fast enough, powerful enough to go into somebody's heart? Moreover, as mechanical engineers, we're really interested in what are some of the mechanical cues that we can use to strengthen these heart cells. So things like stiffness and stretch and the shape that these cells have. Can we use our engineering tools to be able to manipulate these cells to be stronger and more viable to be replacement heart cells? Now, I also want to take this last minute to talk about undergraduate research. This is Thomas Larson, who was an undergraduate in my lab for about a year and a half. And I gave him a challenge. I said, Thomas, we like to look at cells, and we use this big, expensive microscope that is fine for the lab, but if we want to take this technology out of the lab, we need to have something smaller and better. And so I gave him that challenge, and he and I had some ideas about how to take a cell phone and turn it into a microscope. So this is a very interesting idea. All you have to do is use a hemisphere. What you're seeing over here in our prototype lens is that same silicone rubber, that PDMS, that we've been molded. He basically took some ball bearings and pressed it into metal to get that shape. And then he poured the PDMS on that to get the actual lens. And what he was able to do was look at red blood cells or look at onion cells. And this has been fantastic. This has been something that, Husky engineering and undergrads, have taken this to the next level. Now, Thomas was a senior, and I asked him, what do you want to do after graduation? He didn't really have a good answer. I said, what about taking this to the next level? And he had done some entrepreneur competitions on campus and was very excited about that. So he said, yeah, I think I'll start a company. I think because you're used to eating ramen noodles as an undergraduate, you have no problem staying on that kind of diet. But I don't know if he needs to eat ramen noodles anymore, because in September last year, he launched his first Kickstarter and had a pretty good turnout of $91,000 to have the first version of that lens, this 15x lens. And that's great, This is something that he has given to almost, I think over 7,000 people actually have this lens. And it's very useful for high schools where there's no longer the same amounts of microscopes for children. It's also being used to go to Africa to look at infectious diseases. And that's really the focus of his next generation, this 150x lens. This has also gotten a Kickstarter of over $100,000. And it's actually being used now in Africa to look at infectious diseases. But I think this is just a great testament to how the engineering that's being done at UW can be translated to real medical benefits. So I guess the kind of take-home message that I'd like to share with you guys is that these new tools can lead to new strategies. Engineers have been interested in medicine, but we really need to have good partnerships. And I think for me, working with Dr. Nathan White, as well as some of my other collaborators, has been a fantastic way for us to use our engineering skills to really have a real impact on how our health develops. So for my lab, we're interested in how the heart develops, how you have a buildup of plaque in your arteries due to leakiness of your blood vessels, as well as how do you form clots and how strong are your platelets for hemostasis. So I really like to just end with acknowledging the talented individuals that I've been working with and had the privilege to work with. My lab here likes to roll. And I also like to acknowledge my collaborators, Dr. Nathan White, Dr. Jose Lopez, Mike Rainier, and Chuck Murray, who I've talked about our work together in this presentation. And I also like to thank our funding sources. Really, to do this kind of work takes support to pay for the graduate students to be able to do this kind of stuff. So it would not have gone anywhere without the strong support of our funders. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Nate. So that was a fantastic lecture, and I think a great example of how when we get UW engineers together with clinicians, we can solve significant medical problems. So please join me in thanking Dr. Nathan White and Dr. Nate Sniadecki.